After the better part of a decade on the goalie carousel, the Edmonton Oilers might finally have their bell cow starter in Stuart Skinner on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, on today's show, we are going to tackle the goalie position in the abstract. We are going to talk about Stuart Skinner. The first segment, we are going to talk about the track record as far as his experiences and why I feel the Oilers goaltending situation is solidified for at least the interim future. The second segment, we'll dive into the numbers. We'll look at his performance over the last 2.5 seasons. In the third season, I'm just going to make you the pitch as to why you should believe. And I want to start with this principle, and it's a guiding force for evaluation, regardless of sport, regardless of position. There are only a handful of great players at every position. That's what makes those players great, is that they are noticeably better than everybody else, that there is a finite amount of talent within the game at every position, and you are only going to have 3, 4, maybe even 5 guys at a given position who qualify for that elite best in the world conversation. Once you get past that, there are tiers, and everybody is able to sort them out how they feel personally, what they value, because ultimately rankings and opinions, subjective. Not everybody is going to use the same criteria for a player evaluation. And because of that, people are going to have varying opinions, especially on players that are not as solidified or as entrenched or established. So the goaltending position in hockey in particular is especially difficult to evaluate because it is such an environment-based position. And this won't be the first time I draw comparisons to it, but goaltender in hockey is very similar to quarterback in football, in that even if you are the most purely physical, talented guy, there is only so much you can do if the environment around you is not great, if the defense is letting you down, if the coaching staff and the systems are not putting you in a position to succeed. Goaltending is not something, for the most part, that's going to stand alone on its own. That's why you see goalies who are in that middle class, who are constantly rotating and shifting teams. Those guys are constantly rotating and shifting teams because they realize very quickly that even if I was getting paid reasonably well, if I want to put up good numbers so I can get paid again, I need to change my environment. And teams, when a goaltender underperforms, very quickly want to alternate, get somebody else in there. You look at the way a team like the Detroit Red Wings has handled the goaltender position. The Toronto Maple Leafs has handled the goaltender position. The Carolina Hurricanes. I can go on. The LA Kings fall into this category as well. The Ottawa Senators, where if it doesn't work, you got to try and get somebody else in there as soon as possible. And the goaltender position, outside of those 5, 6 truly elite players, once you get past Shesterkin, you get past Saros, Demko, you can put Vasilevsky in there based on legacy, even if he's probably on the back 9 of his career. Bobrovsky is probably not in that first tier, but he's the next tier down. There are a lot of really good goalies in the NHL, but once you get past 6 or 7, once you get past like Jeremy Swayman and you're getting into the next tier below that, that's where we start to get into guys who are not going to be situation proof. And those are the guys who typically are going to be a little bit easier to come by. Those are the guys who are going to be able to get in a trade or find in free agency, because let's be frank here. Franchise goalies do not get to free agency. It's very similar to every position in hockey where just great players just generally don't get there. Sergei Bobrovsky comes to mind as truly the only goalie who got to unrestricted free agency and got that max value contract. And look, we are currently in a market correction phase of the NHL where after 4 years of static or near static salary cap ceilings, players are going to start trying to make up the money they lost during that window that they would have earned if the salary cap had continued to increase that 5 to 6% that it's supposed to year over year. You are going to see Igor Shesterkin reset the goalie market this summer or sometime before next summer, before next July 1. The Rangers will not go to July 1 without Igor Shesterkin under contract for the following season. You are watching it play out in real time in Boston with Jeremy Swayman and the Bruins, who are a week into training camp and preseason games now, and Swayman still doesn't have a contract. He still hasn't reported. We are not talking about someone in that tier. I am not here to convince you that Stuart Skinner can be a top 5 goalie in the world. I am not entirely sure he can be a top 10 goalie in the world. What I am here to convince you of is that Stuart Skinner has been on the Oilers for 2 seasons now, and that he is good enough to complement what the Oilers want to do as a team, that he doesn't need to do a ton. And I'm going to repeat this point at least 3 or 4 times throughout the course of this episode because it's the strongest point. And I said this a ton during the playoffs last year. I vividly remember saying this to Joey when we did the crossover episode with Locked On Stars. As long as Stuart Skinner doesn't lose the Oilers the game, they're going to be in good shape. Stuart Skinner is a game manager goalie. If you are an NFL football person, he is Jimmy Garoppolo. He is Derek Carr. He is Brock Purdy. He is not going to lose you the game. He's going to take care of the layups. He's not going to steal you anything. He's not going to make his teammates better, but he is good enough to be competitive, to make the saves he's supposed to. On occasion, he makes a big save, gives you a little bit of extra juice. But as long as you're reasonable with your expectations, you're not expecting Skinner to be Shesterkin or Vasilevsky or Saros or Hellebuck. If you are expecting him to be a slightly above average goalie, like, the number I said at the end of the playoffs was somewhere between 13 and 9. If Stuart Skinner can be the 9th best goalie in the entire NHL, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, even the 13th, that is more than good enough for the Oilers to be a good team. All you need is a goalie that is not going to kill you. And as long as Skinner can find that baseline, that is not going to hurt you. If Skinner is somewhere between 13th and 9th best goalie in the world, that will give the Oilers more than enough room to be competitive this season. When you are a team as offensively gifted as the Oilers, when you have as much forward talent as the Edmonton Oilers do, your goal as a goalie and a defense is simple. I said it 2 minutes ago talking about the game manager comparison. Just don't lose you the game. And we have seen that. Stuart Skinner has been that bad. We're going to talk about his track record, his individual stats, but his series against the Kings 2 years ago, that was outright bad. There was enough conjecture about starting Jack Campbell in a game against the Kings that it was a serious consideration. So that's not to say I think Skinner is unassailable, that he's absolutely firmly entrenched forever. But I do think in the medium term, in the next year or two, he will be cheap enough, he will be effective enough that him and the Oilers are going to make a good marriage in this short window because it works. The money is there, the opportunity is there, and frankly, I don't know if the Oilers could afford to go out and go to that next tier of goalie. And frankly, I don't know if that next tier of goalie is going to necessarily translate to what Edmonton wants to do. It's complicated. That's why we like talking about this type of stuff here on Locked On Oilers, where we go into the abstract, we try and peel it back and think about this theoretically, because there are so many layers to unpack. We are going to take the first break of today's show. When we come back, we're going to dive into those numbers, try and contextualize those numbers coming up next. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Coming up in the NFL this week, we've got the Giants, my Giants, taking on the Cowboys at home at MetLife Stadium as 5.5-point underdogs on Thursday Night Football. If you think Joe Burrow and the Bengals are going to get right on Sunday against the lowly Carolina Panthers and Andy Dalton, the Bengals 4.5-point road favorites as an 0-3 team, which is crazy to me. The Jets and Broncos, Nathaniel Hackett revenge game. The Jets giving 7.5 points at home to the Denver Broncos. The game I'm most excited for this weekend, though, Eagles, Buccaneers. Jalen Hurts and the Eagles coming off a big win in New Orleans, going down to Tampa Bay to take on Baker Mayfield and the Bucs, who had a bit of a stinker this past week. If you want to get in on the action and have a little bit more fun with your football Sundays, go on over, check out FanDuel.com. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. If you were listening to or watching that first segment and thought it was a bit choppy, I'm sorry. Had quite the sneezing fit over the course of 2 minutes. So if it's a little bit choppy on the ears, I apologize. But as an allergy person, the seasons changing are not kind to me. So if you are a fellow allergy haver, I'm sure you can empathize with my pain. As for Stuart Skinner, as for the Oilers, like I said at the outset, I'm not saying that Stuart Skinner is an elite goalie. I'm not even saying he's a very good goalie. I am saying he is above average and he can do enough that he won't hurt the Oilers. He's fine. He's nothing incredible, but he's fine. And I think something that gets lost in the shuffle here when we're talking about this type of thing, the Oilers have kind of done the hard work in this process already. He's had the growing pains. He had the brutal playoff series. He had the slow start to the regular season this past year. He has calcified. He was able to bounce back from getting sat for a playoff game in the second round. That type of mental fortitude and that type of experience, you can't manufacture that. And that's something that Skinner has processed and worked through in a way that's put him in a position now to be equipped for what's ahead. And that's really the crux of the argument we're going to make in the next segment. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. But as for the numbers, in the regular season, 65, 30, and 10 over the last 2 years, 909 save percentage, 2.68 goals against average, and 15 goals saved above expected over the course of 2 regular seasons as a starter. Those are all solid. League average goaltending is about 900 now, 901, 902, depending on the season. And we've seen that change over the course of the last decade, frankly. You know, when I first started covering hockey, 2015 or so, the general consensus was shooters will be about 9%, goalies will be about 9-10. In the last 10 years or so, that has changed. It is closer to shooters being 10% and goalies being 90%, and that's how we calculate the PDO of 100 as far as luck. You know, if a team has an above 910 save percentage, they either have an elite goalie or a goalie who's playing a little bit above their weight. If that's below 910, that's either a below average goalie or somebody who's getting unfortunate. And then the same thing for shooting logic. If it's over 10%, that's an above average or lucky shooter. If it's multiple seasons, you would say they're an above average shooter. If it's only one, you would say they're lucky. And ditto the inverse if it was below that number. And then the playoff numbers are going to sound a bit jarring when I read them in a second, but I'm going to contextualize them for you. In the playoffs, 19 and 15, 895 save percentage, 3.05 goals against average, and minus 1.44 goals saved above expected. So I am not here to tell you those numbers don't matter, but I am here to tell you that they are heavily influenced by the bad series against the Kings 2 years ago, and that his numbers for this individual past postseason are a lot more palatable. And look, I'm not saying they're good, but they're workable. If Stuart Skinner is giving the Oilers something in the ballpark of 901 save percentage, 2.45 goals against, that's workable. If he is average with everything else around him, that's good enough. And you always want more. Of course, you always want more. If Skinner can be that much better and he's closer to the 9th best goalie in the world as opposed to like the 13th or 14th, that will make a difference over the course of an entire regular season and a playoff run. I do think that if Skinner can find another gear, and what I mean by that, that's not like energy or motivation. It's he has done the hard work. When we talk about goalies, they typically have in the ballpark of 200 games before they get to the NHL level. That's professional in Europe, that's college, that's junior, that's AHL. Skinner's got more than that. Skinner has 368 Yeah, he has 364, of games across the WHL, the ECHL, and the AHL, plus his 2 years as the majority starter in the NHL. If you can have that 300 games of development, and look, having that many games of developmental tells me that your organization views you as a bit of a project, that they wanted to slow play you to really get you ready. And I'm not saying Stuart Skinner is going to have a long tenure in Edmonton. It might only be another 3 or 4 seasons, but the Oilers have laid the foundation. They have done the hard work in this process. And Skinner has slowly started to find a way. The last point I want to leave you with before we move on to our final segment of the show, where I'm going to give you a real stump speech. He outplayed Jake Ottinger in the Western Conference Finals. And I understand Jake Ottinger had a weird season last year. He was well below his averages, nothing close to what he was 2 years ago, where he was one of the best regular season goalies in the league. And then he was, frankly, arguably the best goalie in the entire playoffs in that first round series against the Flames 3 years ago. And he only played 7 games. That was one of the more remarkable playoff performances and a losing effort by a goaltender I can recall. And for someone like Skinner, who has a bit of a spotty track record, to stand toe to toe and frankly outplay Jake Ottinger, that alone gives me the confidence that there might be a bit more meat on the bone. And we're going to dive into that in the final segment of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So be sure to stick around. We are all driven by the search for more. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work, use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree. Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. The thing I like about Indeed the most is that it is constantly getting better. It leverages over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day. So the more you use Indeed, the better its matching engine gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are talking all things Stuart Skinner. And I find the goalie position to be so interesting from a philosophical perspective, because we struggle to quantify goalie performance so much beyond the basic stats. Save percentage, goals above average, even goals saved above expected. They are limited. We do not have nearly the statistical profiles of goalies as we do of other positions in hockey. I can tell you a lot about an NHL player who's I almost said outfield player, like we were talking about soccer. Any skater other than a goalie, I can give you a very detailed statistical profile to every component of their game. Hockey goalie, we still don't have a great way of tracking pre-shot movement, meaning where the goalie is in relation to the shot. We don't have a great way to track screens, whether or not a goalie can see the puck clearly. We still don't have the most precise shot location data that we can. There is better shot location data that the NHL has somewhere under the hood but refuses to release to the public, that proprietary services like Sport Logic in Canada have access to. But with what we know, it is feasible to say we understand some elements of the position. We do understand that goalie performance, if you are not one of the elite, is not sticky year over year. It's very similar to turnovers in football, where year over year, teams that typically win a lot of fumbles and interceptions one season, they're not going to have that luck multiple years in a row, because you can't scheme to create turnovers. And without those turnovers, defenses are typically going to regress. And it's the same thing with goalies. You can have a great goalie, and we're going to get a great case study of this phenomena this upcoming season. You're taking Linus Ullmark from a Boston Bruins team that is one of, if not the most fundamentally defensively sound teams in the entire NHL, where the forwards and the defense are thoroughly committed to playing as shut down, stifling, clog the ice defense as humanly possible. And Ullmark is going to Ottawa, who hasn't had a good goalie since Craig Anderson. And Craig Anderson hasn't been an above average NHL starter since 2017. It has been a long time for that organization, and they have alternated through a bunch of different candidates, whether it's Korpisalo, whether it's Cam Talbot. They have tried. And if Ullmark cannot make that team competitive with his ability based on what he showed in Buffalo and then the previous few seasons in Boston, I don't really know what else you can do if you're that team other than maybe consult magic or religion, because at that point, if somebody with a track record of borderline elite goaltending cannot get by and be passable on a bad team, then I think you're talking about something with the players on that team as opposed to maybe something that these goalies they've targeted in the past have struggled with. As for Stuart Skinner, I don't think you're going to be talking about him in the same breath as Grant Fuhr. I don't. He is an okay goalie. And we have seen in the last handful of years, you do not need an elite goalie to be seriously competitive to win a Stanley Cup. Florida, Bobrovsky, top of the market, outlier. Vegas, Aiden Hill, Logan Thompson, Jonathan Quick. I think it is more than fair to say Stuart Skinner can be as good as Aiden Hill. That's not crazy. I think Darcy Kemper 2 years ago in Colorado, I think absolutely Stuart Skinner can be as good as him. Stuart Skinner's not going to be as good as Vasilevsky either time. He can be as good as Jordan Binnington, for sure. I don't think he can be as good as Braden Holtby. I think Braden Holtby was in that top. I think Holtby was 5 or 6 a lot. He was 2 or 3 a couple times as well in there. I think he can be as good as Matt Murray. I think he can be good as late career Marc-Andre Fleury. I think he can be as good as Corey Crawford. I don't think he can be as good as Jonathan Quick, though I do think historically Jonathan Quick is going to be very overrated because he's got a lot of wins, because he's American. He was on a team that won multiple Stanley Cups with him as the goalie. I never felt that Jonathan Quick was as good as the numbers when you watched him. I mean, even this past year, he had really solid numbers on the Rangers, but he's not really technically sound. He's not making anything crazy, but I don't think goalie is a deal breaker. I think if you have a goalie who is slightly above average, who can flirt with being good, that's more than enough. And the Oilers, their offense will mitigate a lot of issues. We've talked about it all offseason. I know I say that a lot. If the defense is passable with this offense and Skinner is just fine, the recipe's here. They can outscore a lot of issues. And I do think, and this is my opinion, I do think that over the course of a regular season, this defense will start to find its shape. They will find the right permutation of defensemen of who plays with who. I think that will solve regular season issues. I think ultimately the Oilers' playoff success will come down to whether or not their forwards can adapt and thrive in that playoff style of hockey, where you can't just go up and down, back and forth, because it tires out your defense and puts more responsibility on your goalie. I didn't think Stuart Skinner was bad in the Cup final against Florida. I just didn't think he was great. He was fine. You struggle the first few games. You don't feel great about it. You don't want to be playing from behind because then that puts the target on Skinner's back of if he gives up one more, then it starts to snowball. And when you have and this will be the last point of today's show, when you have a goalie who has no confidence, where one goal feels insurmountable, that's the worst feeling in the world. And I do think Skinner has the benefit of having had that experience. When you are at rock bottom as a goalie, when you get yanked in a playoff series and you get a game to reset, and you are able to mentally and physically respond to that benching by going out there and playing well, that says a lot about you as a player and as a person. You need to have a short memory as a goalie. It's the same exact thing as a quarterback. You throw a pick, forget it. You give up a goal, forget it. We're on to the next play. Because you let that linger, you start to play tight, play tight. That is when you start to make mistakes. It is one of the fundamental principles I have I've always held. I can say that from my personal experiences, just as a kid. You make one mistake. You let a ground ball go through your legs at Little League. You miss a tackle during a football game. You miss a wide open three at basketball. You start dwelling on it. You're like, oh man, I messed up. Let me get my fundamentals. And then your glove is down, but you handcuff yourself and you bring up your glove too soon and you boot the ball, or you miss another wide open three, or you whiff on another tackle because you dive too early because you're trying to make the play because you're overcompensating. It is really hard to stay in that sweet spot of comfort in your abilities and the game situation. Stuart Skinner has proven himself to be a person with resolve, with the ability to bounce back from challenging and adverse situations. That is a strong foundation. The Oilers are not asking him to be Marc-Andre Fleury circa 2010 at the Olympics. They are not asking him to be Carey Price from 2016, 2017. They are asking him to be Stuart Skinner. If Stuart Skinner can be Stuart Skinner, the Oilers are going to have a very successful regular season, and they have the potential to have a very successful postseason. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, we're closing in on 1,600. Every single subscriber, welcome. This is fun, man. This is what it's all about. You find community, you find other people who have the same neurosis you do, and share in the feelings, the highs and the lows. Let me know in the comments, how good do you feel about Stuart Skinner coming into this season, his third season as a full-time NHLer? I will talk to you guys tomorrow, but before we get out of here, please, thank you. First of all, thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of today. And if you could be so kind, please go check out Locked On NHL, where local experts give you all of the insight on a national scale. Hunter Hodes and I are going to be breaking down the Metropolitan Division tomorrow. If the Rangers are going to run it back, if the Devils, with all of their offseason moves, are poised, or if it's just going to be Carolina again. That'll be on tomorrow's edition of Locked On NHL. I will talk to you guys tomorrow on Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Until then, let's go Oilers.